So Moses meets God for the first time in the middle of the desert in Midian. Moses could not possibly have known that God knew Moses long before Moses met God. So I'm sure that Moses was surprised when from inside a blazing bush, God shouted Moses' name not once, but twice. God calls out, "Moses, Moses!" A bush on fire caught his attention. The fact that it wasn't turning into ashes drew him in. But it was God's familiarity, the fact that God knew his name, that compelled him to come closer. And as Moses approaches God, right away, God lays the foundation for their relationship by commanding Moses to remove his shoes. I was curious about this. Why was this necessary? And why only his shoes? I discovered that the priests in the Old Testament tabernacle ministered with bare feet. And one simple suggestion for this is that you don't trap the world's dirt into God's house. God tells Moses to remove his shoes because he's standing on holy ground. And this is Moses' first introduction to God, who is other, capital O, who is separate. And later, we read in Leviticus that God tells Moses he and the Israelites are to be holy, for God is holy. God's holiness makes demands of those who worship God. It's easy to come away from this interaction, where Moses must remove his shoes to even stand near God, feeling like maybe God is too far away, too far removed from us. But I'd like to suggest a different way to think about it. God is extending grace to Moses here, and to any who would worship God. That includes everyone in this room. God wants Moses to come near, so God provides the conditions necessary for Moses to stand on holy ground. God is saying, take off your shoes so that you can stand near and talk with me. God is other, separate, but God desires to be near to us. Then God introduces God's self to Moses for the first time. Have you ever had a stranger come up to you and introduce themselves by saying something like, "You don't know me, but I'm friends with your sister or your father or your spouse"? This used to happen a lot to me, and sometimes it still does, whenever I meet someone from Southwest Virginia, which is where my family are from. My papa was a fairly well-known preacher and hospital chaplain in Marion, Virginia. And I cannot tell you how many times some stranger in a Walmart in Bristol would say, "You're Neville Mazingo's granddaughter, aren't you?" And then we would swap stories about my grandparents, or better yet, about my dad and all of his shenanigans from when he was a teenager. When God introduces God's self to Moses, it's like he's saying, "I know your grandfather." And because God knows all of Moses' ancestors, Moses can trust God. This is the beginning of a long, enduring, deep relationship between God and Moses. And it's striking that right off the bat, God instructs Moses to remove his sandals, and in doing so, sets God's self apart from Moses. But in the very next moment, God extends hospitality to Moses by connecting God's self to the Hebrew family that Moses has been apart from for so long. Do you remember how Moses responded to God? Moses hid his face. The text says that he was afraid to look at God. And maybe that fear was really reverence. Maybe that's just what one does when you're in God's presence. But I bet that Moses was terrified. Could it be that Moses was afraid of punishment for killing the Egyptian? Maybe he hid his face because he feared that his past had finally caught up with him. God called to him by name and appeared in fire. Maybe the bush's next move was to shoot those flames out at Moses and create a Raiders of the Lost Ark moment. You ever seen that movie? You know, where that creepy guy in the glasses tried to look upon God in the Ark of the Covenant and suffer the consequences. Maybe Moses was thinking that after all these years, he'd been found out, discovered, 40 years in hiding just to be called out by a bush. But God doesn't want to talk about Moses' crime. God tells Moses that God has seen the misery of the Israelites and the oppression brought by their Egyptian masters. God has heard the cries of their affliction. God knows about their suffering. And God desires to bring them out of their slavery and into a good, spacious land of their own. In the burning bush, God has come down so that God might bring the Israelites up out of Egypt. That was no angel in the burning bush. That was God. For a good 3 verses, Moses was probably nodding furiously. Yes, God, do it for them. And then God drops a bomb when God says, all right, cool. So Moses, you go and you talk to Pharaoh and get my people out of Egypt. Moses is like, wait, what? How did this turn on me? Enter identity crisis. Moses doesn't ask God, why? Why me, God? He asks God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God doesn't pump Moses up by listing all the ways that Moses is qualified for this mission. Instead, God grounds Moses' identity in God's presence with him. God says, I will be with you. God wants Moses to view himself in light of God's presence with him. But Moses is still not reassured. He needs more information about God. What is it about God that's going to make a difference for the Israelite people? What can he say to the Hebrews that will convince them not only to follow him out of Egypt, but also that the God he represents is legitimate? And God says, drum roll please, I am who I am. This name for God is mysterious, to be sure, but it is also very simple. God can only be compared to God's self. This name exalts God far above any other gods and far above any human comprehension. God is singular. God is 3. God is other, capital O. Here again, Moses encounters a holy God in whose presence he must stand barefoot and hide his face. And yet, this is an instance in the Old Testament when the Hebrew language doesn't have a perfect translation into English. The verb here in Hebrew is haya, meaning to be. And one interesting transliteration of this name is being there, with hyphen, being there. Really, when God says, I am who I am, God is saying to Moses, I will be there with you. God identifies God's self with an active verb that implies ongoing action and assures God's presence with Moses and the Israelites. God is saying, when the Israelites ask you, Moses, for the name of the God who sent you to them, tell them, I will be there with you, has sent you. And on the heels of this name, God reiterates God's former introductions. You shall say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, has sent me to you. And by this name, remember, it's like I know your grandfather. By this name, the Israelites will know that this is the God who has been with them from the very beginning. By naming Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God reminds them of God's presence in their covenantal history. This transcendent, holy God is also immanent and near. These two things for us are totally at odds. We cannot be both apart from and near to someone else, can we? But God's transcendence and God's immanence are simply not at odds in God's relationship with us. This tension in God's character is one of the things that differentiates God from us and other creatures. And actually, accepting this paradox, holding these two aspects of God in tension, he's far and near, are crucial for you and I. Because long after the Israelites have left Egypt, this holy, transcendent God would take on flesh and be born as a baby in Bethlehem. That same God would be physically tortured and die on a cross. God would again come down so that we might be brought up. God came down so that we might be brought up. God heard and saw the afflictions of God's people and interceded physically to deliver them. The God who identifies as I will be there with you moved on behalf of the Israelites, just as God moved on our behalf. God saw our desperation, our utter inability to be near to God. And God, whose name is rooted in action, physically interceded for us. That intercession, that death and resurrection, restored our nearness to God. God came down so that we might be brought up.